All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus 320 Tech Talk. What do all those buttons do? Thank you again for joining me. Happy Friday. Hope you've all had a great week, and I appreciate you tuning in again. So, the topic of today's discussion is going to be the APU buttons on the overhead panel of the Airbus. So, as always, picking up where we left off last time, we have made our way down to kind of the center area section here on the overhead. So, first off, we'll just talk a little bit about, the APU itself. I'll kind of give you a little bit of, as always, the high-level stuff that I wanted to talk to you about, and we'll come back and talk about the button specifically. And the last thing I wanted to do is just kind of tell you a little story that I had from flying about 2 weeks ago. It was just kind of a real-world situation where this APU played a big part for us, and I'll tell you all about that when we get there. So, right off the bat, like I said, let's just talk a little bit about the APU itself, why it's there, what is it for, what does it do, all this kind of stuff. So let me bring up a photo while we're talking about this. So the APU, it looks something like this. Right off the bat, you probably realize that this looks very different from a, one of the engines that's hanging out of the wings. And there's certainly a fair deal of differences, but right off the bat, this is an example of a centrifugal flow engine, which differs once again from an axial flow engine. And all that really means is just the direction or the path that the air takes through this engine is quite different, in the sense that the air intake is actually on the bottom of the APU here. And there's several things that happen on the inside that are the same steps in the process of how an axial flow jet engine works, but just like I said, kind of the directional flow of the air through this engine is quite different. So as I said, air comes in the bottom, goes through the center part of the engine, and it gets exhausted straight out the back, which once again, the axial flow engine just has the air moving like completely straight through the whole the makeup of the engine, let's say. So just like I said, right off the bat, a glaring, striking difference that probably, catches you when you're first looking at this. So, like I said, the APU, first of all, if you don't know what it stands for, it means Auxiliary Power Unit, okay? So just a little bit of history here to start with. Initially, as aircraft started to kind of develop, there was more jets flying around, and, just bigger and bigger airplanes, kind of comprising the fleets at air carriers and all this kind of stuff. In the beginning, they were a fair deal simpler in some regards. And one type of thing that I want to say here is that early on there weren't APUs as widely used in aircraft to begin with. And I'm really not sure at what point in aviation history the APU really kind of came about to be like a standard used piece of equipment that gets installed into most aircraft. If you consider the job that the APU does for you in this heyday, you were actually kind of relying on ground equipment to facilitate some of the support that the plane needed, that this APU later on came down the line to do for us. So before this time, we used to have to get electrical power from somewhere on the ground while the plane was just kind of sitting there at the gate when the main engines weren't running. It also had to get some kind of bleed air, potentially for like starting the engines, of course, but of course like supplying air conditioning to the back of the airplane when it was on the ground. So once again, you had all these carts that kind of needed to be there and needed to support the airplane like any time it went through a station or went to wherever it was operating in the world. So like I said, the invention or the usage, let's say, of the APU was kind of a revolutionary thing, because it kind of brought along the ability for the plane to be even more self-sustaining than it already was for ground operations. So this just is a huge advantage for a multitude of reasons, but I think you get the picture. But like I said, I just wanted to kind of paint that picture of a little bit of the history about how it kind of came about. So like I said, along with this application of the use of the APU engines in the airplane, of course, became an enhanced level of redundancy in the form that once again we have several systems in the airplane that you need the air power and the electrical power, and it's just kind of a nice thing to have if we're flying around and one of the main engines goes down for any reason, or even components of the main engine kind of get taken offline. It's just nice to kind of have the APU standing by there and able to assist us in some various situations. And kind of like I said, I touched on it in the beginning of the conversation. We'll come back and talk about it, but the APU is really one of those things in the airplane that it's really truly missed if it's not there. It's kind of like the saying about, you don't really know what you've got until it's gone kind of thing. So we're so used to operating with it, in our normal day to day. It's a nice to have kind of thing, but you certainly, feel some pains when it's not there, or it's inoperative, or what have you. So that is just some kind of initial stuff that I wanted to tell you guys about. So let's see. I will bring up just for the next portion of the talk here, I'll bring up a different slide that we can look at. So let's take a look at just the status page for the APU here while I'm kind of talking about the next section here I wanted to tell you about. So oops, I'm sorry, that's the wrong slide. We wanted to look at the actual APU page. So let's bring that guy up. So like I said, let's next talk a little bit about when we're using this APU, and there's really kind of three drawn out scenarios that we are using this to do different things in different cases for us. But right off the bat, we use it on the ground, of course, for normal operations. So when you typically we come out and we first bring power onto the airplane. I mean, there's a substantial amount of time where we kind of are using the ground support equipment to bring power onto the airplane from the jet bridge, and also most of the time we're getting preconditioned air from the jet bridge as well. But sometime about 10 minutes before we're actually ready to push back and get off the gate and get underway with our flight, we'll turn the APU on, and we'll kind of switch all these systems over to the internal sources, or in other words the APU. So we'll push back off the gate. We'll use the APU to start the engines. After both engines are started, we'll shut the APU down, and we'll go off flying, on our merry way until we get to the destination where we land. And one of the very first things we do on the Airbus is we bring the APU up when we're clearing the runway, or we're running like our post-landing checklist, let's say. So, and it'll come up and be online and be there to support us until we're pulling into the gate, at which point we shut down both the main engines. So there's kind of this time period there where the ground crews haven't had a chance to kind of hook up the outside air and the outside electrics to the airplane. So we kind of still need to have all the systems in the airplane powered. So there's kind of this little window of time where the APU will continue to stay up until the ground crew has a chance to kind of get everything plugged into the plane, and at that point we'll bring the APU down if we desire to do so. So kind of like I said, just a few general scenarios about when we're using this normally on the ground. Another interesting time that we'll use the APU is during takeoffs. Now, the reason why we do this is actually for performance reasons. So if you consider the main engines, they do a lot for us, of course, when we're during our normal operations. One of the biggest things they do is, of course, provide bleed air for conditioning the cabin, all this kind of stuff, and keeping it cool back there. But in the process of doing that, you're actually extracting a little bit of the efficiency and the power capability out of the engine. So you have these situations where you actually want to utilize that extra airflow to keep it going through the engine and not kind of sap that power off, asking the airplane to pressurize or run the pneumatic systems on the airplane while we're taking off. Because let's say we're leaving maybe a high altitude airport on a hot day, or the airplane's very loaded, or we're trying to get off a shorter runway than what we normally have available to us. So these are all different reasons why we might need to have the extra performance capabilities of the engines to allow us to deal with those various situations and operate the airplane safely. So here is an instance where actually you'll leave the APU on for takeoff. So what you're really doing is allowing the APU bleed system to power the packs and do all the initial portions of pressurizing the airplane, keeping it cool, and all this kind of stuff. So like I said, we'll take off with the engine bleeds closed, and once we get airborne, about it's usually when we're doing the final cleanup, we're at the flaps to zero. We kind of come back and we'll turn the APU off at this point, usually somewhere around let's say 1,500 or 2,000 feet, give or take. So it'll come down at that point. It'll switch over onto the engine bleeds at this point in time. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Just like I said, on the takeoff phase of flight, we might be using the APU for performance. And then the last one, it makes a lot of sense, but we would use the APU in flight in the case of if we had an emergency and we needed to kind of utilize these, like the APU as a form of backup for some of our systems. Or there's actually some maintenance deferrals that if certain portions of the airplane are inoperative and maintenance has chose to defer them, like I said, you can actually operate the airplane still, but you have to, in some instances, keep the APU running actually for the entire duration of the flight. So once again, it kind of, you know, serves as a backup to get you home in certain situations where you might not have been able to do so otherwise. So like I said, it's just a really nice thing to have. And like I said, it's missed when it's not there. So, and while we're here too, I could just kind of point out and talk, you know, through, you know, the indications here are mostly self-explanatory, but, you know, just up at the top here, we have the APU generator, you know, the load demand at this point in time. So, you know, the instant that this photo was snapped, the plane was still on ground power actually, which, you know, once again, we can see that the APU is up and running. So the end percentage, or the, you know, the internal engine speed, or whatever you want to say, is up at 100%. The exhaust gas temperature is in a normal range, which these are normal indications, of course. But, you know, like I said, so the APU is available, it's on, it's running, but it's not doing anything for us. So once again, there's no load on the APU generator here, which, like I said, these are these indications on this side. And then on the right side, you can actually see by the horizontally situated valve icon here that there's actually no bleed air coming out of the APU and going into the aircraft systems here. And there's a little bit of residual pressure behind the valve here, and that's just kind of all that it's indicating. But like I said, you know, APU on in this instance, but not doing anything for us. So pretty simple, straightforward. And the flap open thing here, this kind of leads way to, you know, I'll show you a few more slides just to kind of detail and take a closer look about, you know, actually inside that kind of APU compartment and some of the things we might see in there. But that flap is actually just the APU intake flap that allows air to go into the bottom side of the APU there to, you know, do its normal, you know, intake combustion, intake compression, combustion, exhaust, and all this kind of stuff that our normal jet engines do. So let's take a look at a few more slides, and I'll kind of point out a few of these things as we go through them. So this is just, you know, underneath the rear of the aircraft on the Airbus, there's actually two, or on the A320 anyways, there's these kind of two doors that kind of close, I guess, like, you know, say like barnyard door kind of looking things. But we can just kind of take a look up inside the APU compartment where this is actually mounted for us. And, you know, like I said a moment ago, this little section right here is that flap that we're talking about when you see that flap open indication. And this photograph is actually a little deceiving. I had to look at it for a few minutes myself and be like, wait a second, you know, there's some parts missing there. But for whatever reason, they've taken the door off on this side of the APU here because they were doing some kind of job on it, or you know, whatever. But there is another door on the other side there, which I've got a better shot. But I just kind of liked this photo here because it's a little bit better resolution. And like I said, we can kind of point out a few things just right off the bat. So this is, like I said, kind of the main air intake for the engine itself. This is an exhaust kind of shroud piping here that actually kind of goes out the backside of the airplane. You can kind of see the outlet. You know, it's kind of hard to tell from the way this photo is taken, but I think I have another one that kind of shows it. But this is actually an oil cooling exhaust air line. So the way that the APU cools itself is it's got oil, you know, just circulating through the, you know, the parts of the engine that it needs to be, and, you know, there's a heat exchanger that basically like blows air, you know, somehow over this oil that's flowing through the exchanger, and it's kind of extracting the heat and it's just kind of dumping it overboard. So that's what we're seeing there. And, you know, the main exhaust pipe of the APU kind of goes out in the rearward direction here. It's kind of hard to see. I think I have another one. But it is, let me see one of these other slides here if I can point it out to you. But I just wanted to point to the bleed piping that's coming off of the APU there itself. Like I said a moment ago too, this kind of shows an example of the other side of this door here. And this door also too really kind of completes the picture. If, you know, and you can imagine in your mind about how the air is flowing, you know, through this APU. There's kind of this like elbow shaped like ducting here that is part of the way that the air is flowing, you know, ultimately into the APU. So you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit. Like if both of these doors were closed up, this little routing, you know, portion here would kind of like, you know, it would seat up, you know, obviously as it was designed to kind of deliver the air from the inlet flap here where it flows through, you know, the bottom side of the airplane, and then through this little area here, and then up ultimately into the APU itself. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Like I said, you're going to use your imagination a little bit with that one. But like I said, let me see if we can kind of see it in this picture here. But this piping here that comes off is the APU bleed line itself that supplies the bleed air into the other parts of the aircraft system that need it. So that is are some of the main components that I wanted to tell you guys about. That's right. And there's one other interesting thing that is also, I think, kind of fascinating about the APU. And let me bring up the same slide here kind of once again, because when we're on the ground and the aircraft is using the APU, there is certainly a lot of times where you have the need for the aircraft to like stay powered and stay cooling itself, but you won't always actually have people in the flight deck. So Airbus has actually designed in a substantial safetying mechanism into the APU itself that basically allows us to just completely leave the airplane on its own with the APU running, this was kind of interesting to me when I first started to learn, bigger aircraft. Early on in like my flying, it was always like company policy that you could never leave an airplane if the APU was running, and there was a reason for that, which differed, which I didn't really kind of realize it at the time. But those aircraft that I was flying back then, they didn't have this kind of automatic system that would actually shut the APU down if conditions were not normal, or in fact if there was a fire in the APU compartment there, the airplane is actually designed to extinguish the fire on its own without you having to do anything. So it's just kind of like an interesting thing that Airbus is designed into their system. I think a lot of other aircraft, in this present day and age, like the new ones anyways, kind of they probably have similar workings of their system. But like I said, just that interesting fact about the automatic shutdown nature. Like I said, it allows us to kind of leave the airplane on its own for periods of time and not have to worry about it. And it kind of gets really like an overload of data, and it kind of cracks me up. The last carrier that I was at, we actually had to memorize like all the conditions that would cause the APU to auto shut down. And it's kind of like one of those things. It's kind of like a gee whiz thing that you could just rattle every single condition off of the top of your head. It wasn't really very practical for actually truly like needing to be out and safe, while you're operating the airplane. But just, to give you an example, or I just wanted to kind of specify and tell you exactly what conditions would shut down the APU on the Airbus. It is as follows, and it's kind of a lot, so I'm going to say it kind of fast, but I'll try to include it in the comments, or the description section on the bottom of the presentation here. But the conditions that will do this are a fire, if the air inlet flap is closed, an overspeed condition, no acceleration on startup, a slow start, EGT over temperature, no flame, reverse flow, low oil pressure, high oil temperature, DC power lost, overcurrent, sensor valve, IGV failure, ECB failure, no speed, underspeed, loss of overspeed protection, oil system shutdown, inlet overheat, clogged oil filter, and loss of EGT thermocouple. So you can see there, there's just a whole lot of things that will actually cause this APU to shut down on its own. And I just kind of wanted to brief over real quick, what some of those conditions are if York area. So one further thing to build on top of that to wow you guys here is actually Airbus has done something as well for the ground crews. If for some reason the ground crews notice that there was a fire, or something was maybe not so much for the fire scenario, but if something was dangerous, like somebody was like too close to the APU, or there's some kind of problem that I'm kind of struggling to think of a scenario to kind of tell you what this might be. But if there was some reason that the ground crew determined that they needed to shut down the APU, Airbus has actually built in this shutdown switch here into the ground service panel. So this is, we're kind of up underneath the center of the belly, or more towards like the nose gear of the airplane. There's this little access panel, and on the right here what you're seeing is this is just the ground power plug that's plugged into the plane. You have this little panel here that tells us a couple different things about what's going on with that portion of the system. But like I said, on the right here we have a couple of things that relate directly to the APU. So it's just the fire light that would come on if the APU detected there was a fire there. But like I said, the point of bringing up the slide here is just to show you this little button that the ground crew could use to shut off the APU if there was nobody in the flight deck to do it for them. So kind of an interesting thing that, like I said, that Airbus thought to incorporate. One other thing too that I could think to tell you, it's kind of, I've always kind of found this interesting about the Airbus, and to the best of my understanding, and I'm more than open to input if somebody out there knows the real reason for this, or if I'm wrong about this, but an interesting part of the APU area on the Airbus that I think other airplanes kind of have similar designs, and their scoops kind of look different, in some regards. Airbus kind of has it on the dead center, like bottom of the airplane here, as you can see. But there's this little kind of shovel-looking thing right here, and my understanding is this just kind of it allows the airflow to kind of flow most efficiently into this intake here, and I think it also potentially prevents FOD or foreign object damage or debris from being sucked up into that intake there. So like I said, if anybody knows for certain why it was designed that way, those are my best guesses. But it's just kind of an interesting thing when you kind of look up there. You're like, oh, this just looks like this thing's always sticking off here. It just kind of looks kind of funny because it sticks down in the airstream. But like I said, I'm 99% sure that's what we're talking about. And one other thing to kind of circle back to, one of the things I had mentioned earlier on in the discussion, but if you see this little port here, and you remember we talked about the oil cooling exhaust little opening there, that is what that is. If you're kind of curious and you're outside of one of these airplanes, you're looking up wondering what that hole opening there is, that is what it is for. So okay, let's come back and we'll take a look at the overhead panel once again, and we'll just kind of talk about the buttons, real briefly. I'm just going to go straight to the slide with where I've done the lights test, but just to show you the different indications you might see on the top here. So the fault light obviously would come on if the APU was running and one of those faults, like that long list of all those boring things I told you a few minutes ago, where it was to occur. The fault light would come on, and that's just all that it's telling you is one of those conditions was registered or met. The master switch, once again, this is kind of like a push in, and spring loads back out kind of switch. It just kind of turns the APU on, so it powers up the electrics. It kind of runs like a little, like a self-test. It opens up some of the fuel valves. And there's, I want to say there's one other, kind of a basic technical thing that's going on inside there. But it basically just like provides power to the system, first of all. So it powers on the APU. Well, if you actually want to start it, though, you've actually got to come down to the next button and just very simply use the start button. So you just press the button once and it spring loads back out. When the APU has come up to full power and the plane is registering that it's making acceptable power, that just the green avail light will come on up on the overhead here. And like we saw a minute ago, we had the indication on the status display that would tell you that as well. And there's actually, interestingly enough, like a little ECAM memo that will come up on the top, the engine and warning display there. I forgot to take a picture of that one, but it's pretty simple and straightforward. That will actually come on when the APU is available. So that about wraps up most of the content of the technical stuff that I wanted to tell you guys about. And I pulled one other slide. I didn't really get to bring it up and let you look at it for a minute. But I'll just leave this one up. You can kind of look while I'm talking through my story here. But like I said in the beginning of the presentation, the APU is certainly one of those things that you really miss when it's not there. And the reason is it just makes our workday like all the more harder than it normally is, because we have to do a couple extra steps. Number one, we have to take extra precaution, keep the airplane cooled down when we're on the ground. But number two, we actually have to use an external air cart to get that air pressure to start the engine. So it's just kind of, a whole lot of extra procedures and things that were needed to do just to get the airplane, up and running and off the gate and up and going. So anyways, a few weeks ago, I showed up for a trip and it was day one, and, first leg, we're supposed to operate down to Las Vegas. And of course, this day in Vegas, it was like 120 degrees on the ground. So, me and the captain are, getting in the plane, and we're looking at, the flight release. And of course, one of the first things we do is check what items are deferred or what things are not working on the airplane today when we got to go out and fly this thing. So right off the bat, the APU being deferred, catches your attention, and you're just like, oh, well, shoot, this is very inopportune considering we're flying this airplane down to Las Vegas and it's hot down there, and we know it's going to be a hard time keeping the plane cool and just doing these extra steps that I kind of mentioned a moment ago. So we actually called the company and we said, hey, is there any way that we can just have a different aircraft dispatched down there, because hey, this is like the hottest station in the system today, and it would be really nice to take an airplane down there that has a working APU. So you know, they looked at their system schedule and everything, and for whatever reason they're like, no, you know, we don't have another airplane that we can send down there today, so I'm sorry you guys are stuck with that. So okay, no problem. So we take the airplane down to Vegas and we get on the ground, and we you know, kind of brief the station ahead of time, like, hey, the APU is not working, like, you know, we need to get the ground air hooked up right away, we need to make sure we keep the back of the airplane cool because it's so hot here on the ground today. So you know, they did, you know, a good job, and you know, we got the air on the airplane. But what happens is, you know, once you get a fully loaded Airbus, as best as these preconditioned air systems are on the ground, there's only so much they can do for you, unfortunately. So the plane actually starts to kind of heat up in the back. And what you have to do when you start the engines, you actually have to pull the preconditioned air off as part of the normal procedural stuff. And then, you know, you have to use this high pressure air to start the engines. And it's not till after you get the engine started that you can actually get, you know, bleed air from those systems to kind of bring the AC back on. So if you kind of imagine what's going on during this whole situation unfolding. So we load everybody up. They're starting to get hot in the back. We pull the ground air off that was providing the cooling from the jet bridge. And everybody's starting to get, you know, really hot pretty quickly. And like ideally, you know, you would hope to not have to subject people to, you know, this condition for, you know, maybe not more than 5 minutes or something when we got the engine started. So anyways, sure enough, the ground crew, you know, was having some sort of like massive problem with the air cart that they were using to provide the pressure once again to start the engines. And so we're sitting there for like, you know, it's 5 minutes and it's 10 minutes and it's 15 minutes and it's like 20 minutes. And, you know, they just could not figure out what was going on with the ground cart. And like, very sadly, it got so hot in the back of the airplane. I mean, it was about 100 degrees in the very aft, you know, section of the airplane, which is where it kind of gets the most hot, you know, when you have all this body heat on there and no air conditioning. So it was really, you know, kind of a not a you know, a favorite decision to make, but you know, at that point in time, it was kind of creating a health hazard for people on the airplane. So we actually had to offload everybody, take them all, you know, off the airplane. You know, they had to go back into the terminal, so you know, the ground crews could figure out, you know, what they were, what the problem was with the ground, you know, equipment there. So, you know, we kind of had to do this whole, like, you know, end planning, deplaning. So everybody, you know, is kind of getting aggravated, understandably so, as passengers. And it was just like a whole lot of extra work, you know, that we had to do as a flight crew. But you know, things of course got, you know, squared away and figured out. We went on our way, but it was just like I said, a glaring example of like just the fact that like this APU was not operational. We didn't have the luxury of using it. I mean, it caused like an hour extra delay that didn't need to happen if we had just been able to dispatch down to Las Vegas with a working APU. So just kind of a real world example. And I hope that that all kind of, like I said, makes sense, everything that I was trying to explain to you guys. So if it doesn't, feel free to leave some questions down in the comment section there. And once again, no questions came in this week, so nothing for the Q&A today. But as always, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, hit subscribe. It just kind of helps me kind of get my videos circulated out there, and you know, the kind of more viewership I'm growing, you know, the more engaging I'm able to make this for everybody, and the more questions that come in, it just kind of propels and fuels the whole channel forward. So once again, I really appreciate you guys watching. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk again real soon. Thank you.